I recently started playing Assassin's Creed Shadows and I have to admit, I went in with some reservations. I was worried it would be just another example of the well-known tiresome Ubisoft formula. Games that seem more focused on consuming every possible hour of our time than on delivering actual fun, often resorting to tedious and repetitive tasks. Unfortunately, it only took the first 10 hours or so for that gut feeling to be confirmed. In my experiences with Valhalla, which I eventually dropped, and Far Cry 6, which didn't really grab me, already signaled a sense of fatigue setting in. Still, I held out hope that Shadows, considering the controversy surrounding it and the extra development time, could represent a step in a different direction. And it's not that it's a bad game necessarily, but it repeats many of the elements that wore me out in previous Ubisoft and countless other open-world games, which is not exclusive to Ubisoft, mind you, but they're one of the worst offenders when it comes to it. And before someone asks what was I expecting, let me remind you that Assassin's Creed Mirage actually did seem to attempt to move in a different direction. It felt like a welcome return to a more concise experience, stepping away from the often unnecessary bloat of its older brothers. Apparently though, Mirage was the exception, not the new rule. So what I want to talk about here is precisely this feeling that many games seem determined to soak up every minute of our free time. It doesn't matter if an activity could be wrapped up in 5 minutes. If the game can stretch it to 15, it often will. And it's true that some people consider playtime, the value per hour metric, as a factor when deciding whether to buy a game. But I believe most would agree that ultimately what truly matters is the quality of the fun provided, not how efficiently a game manages to pad out its runtime. After all, it's always good to remember that playing video games shouldn't feel like a second job, and if that's how it is for you, you're probably doing something wrong. So let's take a look at why this feeling of exhaustion seems particularly pronounced in recent Ubisoft games, what the key indicators of this formula are, and just as importantly, let's look at some positive examples of open or semi-open worlds that actually respect the player's time. The Ubisoft formula, especially as applied to their open worlds, follows a recipe that has become quite familiar by now. The foundation is a gigantic open world, sprinkled with points of interest. To this, add extensive skill trees and a generous layer of gear management. To bind it all together, you have countless side quests, a narrative that attempts to be nonlinear, and of course, the classic towers or viewpoints for clearing the map. The side effect is that, more often than not, each newly discovered icon feels less like an invitation to exploration and more like a heavy reminder of how much stuff is still left to check off a list. And I think it's important to acknowledge, this structure only became a cliché because for a good while it worked, and worked very well. Many of its elements have been borrowed by games across various genres, and even the complete recipe had its heyday, especially when it felt fresh and new. And I actually had a lot of fun with Assassin's Creed Origins, which I consider one of the best games in the series, and Far Cry 5 was also pretty fun. The problem is that many of these ingredients were already present in earlier games. As Ubisoft increasingly doubled down on repeating the same recipe, that dish that was once delicious and a personal favorite started to feel mundane, something you might stomach if you're really hungry, but you generally prefer to avoid it. The feeling is now that each new release is built upon an unchanging checklist, and Assassin's Creed Shadows unfortunately seems to follow this playbook almost on autopilot. And again, let me be clear, Shadows is by no means a terrible game. I don't think anyone would say it's the best Assassin's Creed they've ever played, but it's also far from the worst. But the specific combination of a massive world and a repetitive narrative structure focused on taking down a secret organization cell by cell is definitely showing its age. That sequence of getting a clue, investigating multiple locations or targets, identifying the regional leader and then hunting them down, only to restart the cycle in the next area, well, it gets old really fast. Ultimately, the impression remains that no matter how much the setting changes, from Egypt to Greece to England to Japan, the essence of the experience, the central gameplay loop, remains uncomfortably familiar. But the fatigue isn't just limited to the repetitive structure. The game's pacing itself is often a problem. And I know that part of this perception is personal, something amplified by the fact that as the years go by, my age gets bigger, but my free time for gaming doesn't. Because of that, this feeling of sinking hours into a game only to feel like minimal real progress has been made is something that bothers me, and increasingly so. In Shadows, much like other Ubisoft games, it feels like we spend far more time just getting around, walking, riding horses and sailing, than actually moving forward with what's important. The cycle becomes frustratingly familiar. Talk to an NPC here, get a task requiring travel to a distant marker to talk to someone else, arrive there, gather the info, and then track all the way back, or at least fast travel, just to hand in the quest. The result, you dedicate an hour to playing, and looking back, you realize the main storyline has barely moved. Often, the focus seems to be on artificially padding the playtime, with little concern for whether this padding makes narrative sense or actually enhances the player experience. That's when that nagging feeling creeps in, the one where your hobby starts to feel like an obligation, almost like that second job. And this perception slowly drains your desire to keep playing. Deep down, you feel that your time, an increasingly scarce resource, isn't being rewarded by the experience on offer. Beyond personal fatigue, the narrative itself struggles from this sluggish progression, especially in non-linear storylines. The long gaps between story moments, filled with lengthy travel, side quests, and other distractions, often cause you to lose the narrative thread. Dramatic tension dissipates, important details get forgotten, and the story's overall impact becomes diluted in a sea of activities that add little substance to the narrative core. But after finally getting through all that travel, you reach your destination. And what usually awaits you there? The answer is often predictable. More generic fetch quests or tasks, more enemy camps to clear out, and yet another flood of collectibles is scattered across the map. And let's not forget how the non-linear story structure often creates something of a disconnect. You reach a crucial plot point only to find you're under the recommended level. The solution for this is to dive into repetitive side content purely to grind the necessary XP so you can finally get back to what actually matters. Assassin's Creed Shadows even adds another layer to this dynamic. The progression in the skill tree is tied to your knowledge level. This means that to actually use the skill points you've earned, you first have to raise your knowledge level, typically by exploring shrines and temples or completing yet more side activities. Without the corresponding knowledge level, your earned skill points are effectively useless. Just one more way the game funnels you towards optional side content. Instead of being a journey full of memorable moments and organic discoveries, it devolves into tackling a massive checklist. Every icon on the map becomes just another item to tick off, another task to complete. This saturation of side content, often disconnected from the main plot, ultimately dilutes the impact of the story itself. You're left with the feeling that the game is more concerned with filling your time with activities than with crafting a cohesive, engaging, and above all, memorable experience. Another problematic aspect is the illusion of depth that many of these games try to create. At first glance, they seem packed with complex systems, RPG elements, countless weapon and armor sets, intricate skill trees. In practice, however, much of this complexity seems designed more to artificially inflate the game's size than to genuinely improve the gameplay or immersion. The sheer number of options can be overwhelming, but the customization often feels superficial, making the sense of progression feel hollow. The granularity of the upgrades is often so fine that individual improvements become almost imperceptible. You level up and earn a skill point, then you rush to the skill tree thinking I'm gonna make it count, only to unlock a 2% bonus on something. The result is that you don't feel like you're becoming more powerful. It feels more like you're just ticking numerical boxes the game itself has set up. This feeling of stagnation is often compounded by the level scaling, where enemies in new areas conveniently level up alongside you, effectively neutralizing much of your hard-earned progress and effort. This shallowness isn't limited to the progression systems, it often extends to the narrative itself. Because the nonlinear structure can't predict the order in which players will tackle things, developers are often forced to dilute or simplify the central storyline, particularly during the game's middle act. As a result, despite the sheer volume of points of interest, side characters, and quests, the overall experience can feel surprisingly shallow, betraying the vast amount of content on display. The promise of a rich and reactive world proves yet again to be mostly a facade. So why does this combination of vast worlds, lengthy travels, endless checklists, and progression systems with minimal impact add up to such a draining experience? To be clear, the issue isn't the size of the world itself. As any fan of Bethesda RPGs knows, massive worlds can be incredibly captivating, and side content isn't the enemy either. In many cases, it's what brings the world to life. The central issue is the constant feeling of putting in significant time for very little meaningful rewards in return. It's that perception of playing a lot, but feeling like you haven't done anything. This disconnect becomes especially noticeable when you don't have much time to play. If your free hours are limited, it's frustrating to feel like that precious time is being drained by repetitive tasks or long, uneventful travels, rather than spent making some progress or actually enjoying the game. The moment an open world stops being synonymous with adventure and discovery and instead turns into a checklist or an obligation, something is lost. You might rack up countless hours on the playtime counter, but the experience itself leaves few lasting impressions. And a clear symptom of this is how forgettable so many aspects of the game become. Entire story arcs, characters who were supposed to be important, that piece of gear you spent hours grinding for, or skills that were theoretically meant to define your playstyle but made little practical difference. But pointing out the flaws of this tired formula doesn't mean advocating for the end of open worlds, nor that every game needs to be short, far from it. The point is to find better ways to craft these experiences, so let's take a look at some positive examples. In recent years, open world has become almost synonymous with ambition in video games, but the fatigue with certain formulas is a recurring subject. The good news is that there are ways out. Many recent games, whether fully open world or semi-open, have found successful approaches that break free from that formula. The solution usually isn't about doing more, but about doing better. The obsession with very large maps and the promise of hundreds of hours often result in diluted, repetitive, and forgettable experiences. It's the quantity over quality trap. The scale might be impressive at first, but it comes to a point where you have so many icons on the map that it turns freedom into obligation and exploration into a chore. In contrast, the less is more philosophy emerges, more contained yet denser worlds with a strong narrative focus and carefully crafted missions tend to offer much more impactful and memorable journeys. Games like God of War Ragnarok and Outer Wilds demonstrate that carefully balanced exploration within compact or semi-open worlds can create interesting experiences where the discoveries feel meaningful. Even larger worlds, as in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, succeed by focusing on curiosity and intrinsic rewards rather than checklist-based activities. These approaches redefine what content means, whether through the challenge of Elden Ring, the packed yet familiar cities of the Yakuza series, or the narrative depth achieved in Disco Elysium's relatively small area. The focus shifts from quantity to quality, from scattered to purposeful. Of course, there are exceptions. The Witcher 3 shows that massive open worlds can work, but only when every area feels like it has something to offer. Most games that chase that scale without the same handcrafted care end up feeling hollow. Perhaps the question we, as players, should ask ourselves more often isn't how many hours of content does this game have, but rather how much of that content is actually worth my time. In the end, a great open world isn't one that offers hundreds of hours of shallow gameplay, but one that stays in your head long after the credits roll, one you feel compelled to return to. And perhaps what Ubisoft and the open world genre as a whole urgently needs isn't even bigger maps or more complex systems. Perhaps what's most lacking are truly meaningful games. Now, even with all these issues, I've always had a soft spot for Assassin's Creed, and honestly, I'll probably continue playing Shadows. Maybe skipping Valhalla actually gave me a break I didn't realize I needed. With some perspective, I also wonder how much of my frustration comes from simply getting older and having less free time to play. When adult life settles in and you have other things to do, you're much less willing to put up with games that don't respect your time. Still, it's getting harder and harder to stay enthusiastic when so many games seem designed just to take up as much of our time as possible, regardless of the quality of that time. And I think about it like making a good spaghetti bolognese. You can't go wrong with the essentials: good olive oil, salt and pepper, ground beef, garlic, good tomato sauce, and celery. It works wonderfully well. Now, if you start throwing in chicken, way too much cheese, mushrooms, and cilantro on top, you might say your recipe is more complex, but that doesn't necessarily make it better spaghetti. Often it just muddles the flavor and ruins what was already good. And the renewed interest in remasters like Oblivion, despite its aging mechanics, shows us that the appeal of open-world games remains as strong as ever. What people are looking for, it seems to me, are games that are fun, charming in their own right, and filled with content that adds value, whatever form that takes, not just sheer quantity. In an era of more expensive games, longer development cycles, and increasingly powerful hardware, the focus needs to shift back to quality, not just the sheer number of hours that can be squeezed out of the player. And if you've made this far into the video but haven't yet liked and subscribed, your analog sticks will start drifting. As usual, thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.